Well, what I want to talk about today is the concept in libraries of what's either called shared collections, or also there is another aspect to this that's called cooperative. In other words, libraries I'll talk about who share their collections, and people have access to different libraries and different collections because the collections are shared. And then I'll talk about cooperative purchasing of collections. There's a couple aspects to this that I'd like to talk about as the lecture goes on, but suffice it to say that you will come across many libraries. For example, public libraries that have multiple branches frequently share their collections among the branches. But it's not necessarily the case of a single library system. It could be a multiple library system. So let's talk about this. First of all, there is the aspect of shared collections. That is, different libraries that share their collections. Several libraries, public libraries in Michigan, have to join cooperatives. And the cooperatives, by definition, mean that the libraries must share their collections with the other libraries in the cooperative. My particular cooperative has decided that MEL certifies or satisfies as the lending of collections to each library, because all the libraries in my cooperative are members of MEL. But in short, there are libraries who actually do look at other libraries in the cooperative and allow borrowers to go to any library within the cooperative. Usually what this means in many cases is that you may borrow the book from one library that's not your home library, and when you return it, you must return it to the same library from which you borrowed it. This is particularly useful because some libraries will not purchase particular titles because they know another library owns the title and that they will share it. Academics have this. In North Carolina, everybody's heard of the Research Triangle, which consists of University of North Carolina State, and Raleigh. And that's all in Duke, which is all in the Raleigh, North Carolina region. That they share their collections with faculty and students from each of the schools. A student at North Carolina State could go to Duke or UNC Chapel Hill and borrow materials. Or, in short, North Carolina could go to Duke and borrow material that might be needed. This way, it develops the strength of the collections, especially in academic institutions, where one library, like North Carolina, could be strong in one particular field and Duke strong in another. Again, this is a situation where a patron from the other library can borrow directly from the shared library, that their card will work just as easily as if they were a patron of the library. In other words, they share their systems as well in many cases, or they just simply add that person to their own particular cataloging system. Now, there's books on the topic, and I've got a link here to an American Library Association book that is on the topic of shared collections. If you wanted to read further about it, you might borrow the book or purchase the book. It's up to you. It's not required for any reason in the class, just merely a link to a book on this topic. You'll probably find it in MEL if you're in Michigan, or what other state you're in. There's probably a library that has that book. Again, this is just merely showing you that books on the topic are available. By no means do I mean you to read the book. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are consortiums. As I said, in Michigan, every public library, by law, must be a member of a consortium. In my case, it is the Woodlands Library Consortium. As I mentioned earlier, there is a requirement that libraries must share their collections with other libraries within their consortia. We at the Woodlands have decided that MEL loans serve the purpose of lending books to each other in the consortia. Now, mind you, MEL as a system, MEL-CAT specifically, as a system, does not specifically determine the library from which the item will come from. Or, you just merely request the item and then MEL picks the library within the algorithm. Prior to MEL in Michigan, there was another system that allowed libraries to borrow, or patrons to borrow from different libraries, and that is a system called MishiCard. Libraries could be a member of the MishiCard system. And libraries who used MishiCard would put on their library card a sticker showing them the library that they go to, that they are a MishiCard provider. Then the patron could visit another library, which is also a MishiCard library, to borrow materials. In other words, a patron of my library might be a MishiCard patron, and they would go to another library, but they could only borrow from that library if that library was a MishiCard library. MishiCard had the system where if an item was lost by a patron, the home library would be sure to pay the cost of the materials. The home library might go to the patron to get them to pay for the materials, but the library did not have to get money from the patron. They get money from the home library, who would then have to get it from the patron. It protected the lending library from loss of materials. MishiCard as a system ceased in 2013. It was very popular and people were very upset that it ceased. MEL has a similar process, but relatively few libraries in much of the state use it, where it's called a MEL lending library. MEL lending library. Now, a library might be a MEL provider, but they don't have to be a MEL lender. That means that the patron, in that case, as I use the word lending library, that means the patron could come to your library, borrow the item, and it would be checked out via MEL. It has a little bit of reimbursement problems. But if a library lends using the MEL-CAT system, then it makes it much simpler from the library's end, and it also assures that any loss of materials is paid for by the home library of the patron. However, MEL has a system that is called a PAC library or a no-PAC library. What is a PAC library? A PAC library will put their materials that they're lending through MEL into boxes or bags or various containers for each book for shipping. Other libraries do not do what's referred to as a PAC system, and they put a sticker directly on the item that they're lending. Now, the interesting thing is, if you're a no-PAC library, you cannot get reimbursement for lost materials. But if you're a PAC library, you can. So, if you're a no-PAC library and you lose the material, or the patron that you lent it to lost the materials, then there is no ability to obtain reimbursement, whereas a PAC library can get reimbursement for lost material. Now, MEL provides service to the state by providing access to database collections of books, sharing books and other media with other libraries around the state. And again, as I said, it uses an algorithm within the system that makes sure that the lending and sharing is fair. In other words, your library might lend as many items as it borrows. Say your library borrows 300 items, then you're expected to lend 300 items to other libraries. In other words, that it should be relatively fair. Now, it's not fair from month to month, but the algorithm tries to make it reasonably fair by the year. A library can put portions of its collection being borrowed, reference DVDs, Blu-rays, or new titles. That means that if a library chooses not to lend movies or DVDs or Blu-rays, then they can say that we will not lend them. That doesn't mean that their patrons could not borrow them, but that library will not lend them. Frequently, libraries will not lend new books copywritten in the same year that the person's trying to borrow them. The cataloging system in MEL will tell you if it's requestable or not requestable, or if it's lent out. In other words, you can't put holds on MEL. You can only look to see if there is an item available in order to borrow it. If they won't lend it, it'll say that they don't, it's non-requestable. And if it's actually checked out, it'll probably have a phrase in there that tells you that it's lendable, but somebody has already borrowed it. Now, I mentioned earlier about shared collections. In short, it's a group of libraries that are in close proximity to each other that often decide that they will more completely collect subject headings, and they will share their collections with each other. Generally speaking, it's a group of libraries that decide to share their collections with the other library's user, and they often have a specific system of moving titles among each other's library. However, what it really means is, for example, in academic libraries, one library might have a very strong American English collection, and another library might have a strong British collection. And between the two of them, they've got a very strong American and British collection. And one library will spend all their money, relatively speaking, they'll spend a lot of their money to be able to buy American literature, whereas the other library will spend a lot of their money on buying British literature, to the exclusion of American literature, and the other library to the exclusion of British literature. But because they lend to each other, they have a very strong collection in both areas. Some libraries in Michigan, like Michigan State and such, developed collection guidelines using statistics that said, in a particular field of study, that you would collect heavily in this area and less heavily in this area. If you're interested in it, just go to Michigan State University and take a look at each unit's, each department, English, history, any particular field in science and such, and take a look at their collection documents, and you will see what I'm referring to. Now, as I mentioned about the cooperative purchases, an example would be OCLC that's used to sell services. In Michigan, that originally started because OCLC would not directly make an agreement with a library. They made an agreement with a consortium. Originally, that was MLC, or the Michigan Library Consortium, which was developed in order to sell OCLC services to a particular library. Later, as OCLC became less important, Michigan Library Consortium changed and became the Midwest Cooperative Library Services. because they do more than purchase agreements. And they became the Midwest because they left Michigan and added Indiana into the mix. So what used to be the Michigan Library Consortium and there was one in Indiana as well. They merged and became the Midwest Collaborative Library Services, or MCLS. In addition to MCLS, there are other shared arrangements. Libraries write the costs to share or write global agreements for a service. For example, let me give you an example of where cooperatives write global agreements for services. The Woodlands, my library's cooperative, will write contract agreements for services like Coupa or Ancestry Plus, and a new one that's coming out is Mango Languages, that they do it in a fashion so that each library does not have to write individual agreements with these services, but the Woodland writes the contract for services and then provides the services to the individual libraries. This saves money overall for each library for the cost of service, because the Woodlands will get better prices. Or, more importantly, in many cases, it's just that they don't have to be concerned about writing contracts because the contract's written by the Woodlands for the benefit of the library. For a discussion topic, what I'd like to do is talk about shared agreements, any agreements in other states that I'm not familiar with. Something as simple as using the branches of a library system to share methods and materials among libraries. Like, for example, Capital Area District Library has 13 branches, and you can borrow from any branch an item and have it shipped to the branch that you're at. It could be as complex as the algorithms that are used by the Michigan Library Electronic Library in order to evenly share materials among libraries in different systems. So I'm just curious what you might have about this. Take and have a discussion about any particular arrangements that you might be aware of in your library. Thank you.